If you had told me a decade ago that the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere would be upended not by a war, not by a revolution, but by the silent arrival of foreign warships in Caribbean waters, I might have dismissed it as a far-fetched scenario. Yet, as I watched the Russian naval flotilla glide into Venezuelan territory, I realized I was witnessing the unraveling of a doctrine that had defined 2 centuries of American dominance. This was not just a military maneuver. It was a seismic shift, a moment when the old rules, the ones written in Washington and enforced from Alaska to Argentina, were suddenly obsolete. The Monroe Doctrine, once the ironclad guarantee of U.S. supremacy in the Americas, was being quietly buried at sea. For most Americans, the news barely registered. A few headlines, some stern statements from officials, and then the story faded. But for those who study the rise and fall of empires, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The United States, which had long treated the Western Hemisphere as its exclusive domain, was now being challenged in its own backyard. And the challenger was not a ragtag insurgency or a distant ideology, it was a resurgent Russia, acting with purpose and precision. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we have to look beyond the headlines and the talking points. We have to examine the deeper currents of history, the choices made in distant capitals, and the unintended consequences of power wielded without humility. The story of Venezuela's break from U.S. control is not just about oil, sanctions, or even ideology. It is about the limits of force, the dangers of arrogance, and the way the world's great powers inevitably create the conditions for their own undoing. Let's rewind to the early 19th century. In 1823, President James Monroe declared that the Americas were off-limits to European colonization. The Monroe Doctrine was less a statement of principle than a warning. Any attempt by a foreign power to interfere in the Western Hemisphere would be seen as a threat to U.S. security. For nearly 200 years, that doctrine shaped the destinies of nations from Mexico to Brazil. It justified interventions, coups, and occupations. It allowed Washington to dictate terms, topple governments, and redraw borders. The hemisphere was, in effect, an American protectorate. But doctrines are only as strong as the power behind them. And power, as history teaches us, is never permanent. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States stood alone as the world's sole superpower. The 1990s were a time of triumphalism. American leaders spoke of a new world order, of democracy spreading inexorably across the globe. The old rivalries, it was believed, had been consigned to the past. Yet beneath the surface, new resentments were taking root. In Russia, the humiliation of defeat and the chaos of the post-Soviet years bred a determination to reclaim lost influence. In Latin America, decades of U.S. intervention had left deep scars. Countries like Venezuela, rich in resources but battered by foreign meddling, yearned for autonomy. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, he tapped into that longing. He promised to use Venezuela's oil wealth for the benefit of its people, not foreign corporations. He forged alliances with Cuba and other leftist governments, challenging the old order. Washington's response was predictable: pressure, isolation, and, when that failed, outright attempts at regime change. Sanctions were imposed, assets were frozen, and diplomatic ties were severed. The goal was clear: force Venezuela to bend to America's will. But the effect was the opposite. The more the U.S. squeezed, the more Caracas looked for allies elsewhere. And in Moscow, Vladimir Putin saw an opportunity. For Russia, Venezuela was more than just a distant partner. It was a chance to break the American monopoly in the hemisphere, to show that the world was no longer unipolar. Russian energy companies invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector. Military advisors arrived, followed by shipments of weapons and equipment. Joint exercises were held, and Russian bombers landed at Venezuelan airfields. Each move was a calculated message: if NATO could expand to Russia's borders, then Russia could project power into America's backyard. The arrival of Russian warships in Venezuelan waters was the culmination of this strategy. It was not an act of aggression, but a demonstration: a reminder that the era of uncontested American dominance was over. The symbolism was unmistakable. For every U.S. base built near Russia, a Russian vessel would appear near the Caribbean. For every sanction imposed, a new partnership would be forged. But the story does not end with geopolitics. At its heart, this is a story about people, about the millions of Venezuelans who have endured hardship, about the generations of Latin Americans who have lived under the shadow of foreign intervention. The U.S. sanctions, intended to force regime change, instead plunged Venezuela into crisis. The economy shrank, inflation soared, and basic goods became scarce. Yet the government survived, propped up by Russian support and the resilience of its people. This is the paradox of power. The more the United States tried to isolate Venezuela, the more it drove Caracas into the arms of America's rivals. The more it insisted on its right to dictate terms, the more it revealed the limits of its influence. And as Russian warships anchored off the Venezuelan coast, the world saw not just a challenge to American authority, but the emergence of a new reality, a world where power is contested, where alliances are fluid, and where the old rules no longer apply. What does this mean for the future? It means that the Western Hemisphere is no longer an American lake. It means that countries like Venezuela have options, that they can play the great powers against each other, that they can assert their own interests. It means that the Monroe Doctrine, for all its history and rhetoric, is now little more than a memory. But it also means something deeper. It means that the United States, for all its military might and economic clout, can no longer assume that its will is law. It must learn to compete, to persuade, to build partnerships based on respect rather than coercion. The age of empires is not over, but the age of uncontested dominance is. The world is entering a new era, one defined not by the dictates of a single power, but by the interplay of many. As I watched those Russian ships glide into Venezuelan waters, I realized I was witnessing not just the end of an era, but the birth of something new. The question now is not whether America can restore its old dominance, but whether it can adapt to a world where power is shared, where influence must be earned, and where the future belongs to those who can navigate the complexities of a multipolar age. The shockwaves from the Russian naval presence in Venezuela did not end at the water's edge. They rippled through diplomatic circles, intelligence agencies, and the corridors of power in Washington. For the first time in generations, American policymakers were forced to confront a reality they had long denied: the Western Hemisphere was no longer immune to the rivalries and entanglements that defined the rest of the world. The illusion of hemispheric immunity, so carefully cultivated since the days of Monroe, had been shattered. Yet, the most profound impact was not on governments, but on the people of Latin America. For decades, the narrative had been that the United States was the indispensable nation, the guarantor of stability and prosperity. But for millions, that promise had rung hollow. They remembered the coups, the interventions, the economic experiments that left their countries poorer and more divided. They saw in the Russian ships not just a challenge to American power, but a symbol of possibility, a sign that the old order could be contested, that new alliances could be forged. Contrast this with the American perspective, where the arrival of foreign warships was seen as a provocation, an affront to national pride. The official response was swift and predictable: condemnations, warnings, and a flurry of diplomatic activity. Yet beneath the bluster, there was a sense of unease, a recognition that the tools of the past were no longer sufficient. Sanctions, threats, and isolation had failed to bend Venezuela to America's will. Instead, they had created the very conditions that allowed Russia to step in. This is the irony at the heart of the story. The United States, in seeking to preserve its dominance, had inadvertently hastened its decline. By treating Latin America as a backyard rather than a community of equals, by imposing its will rather than building genuine partnerships, it had sown the seeds of resistance. And when that resistance found a powerful ally in Russia, the balance of power shifted in ways that few in Washington had anticipated. But the consequences extend far beyond Venezuela. The Russian presence in the Caribbean is a signal to other nations that alternatives exist, that the world is no longer divided into spheres of influence controlled by a single power. It is an invitation to rethink alliances, to explore new forms of cooperation, to assert sovereignty in the face of external pressure. For countries long accustomed to navigating between great powers, this is both an opportunity and a challenge. Consider the broader context. Across the globe, the old certainties are crumbling. In Europe, NATO faces new tests as Russia asserts itself in Ukraine and beyond. In Asia, China's rise is reshaping the balance of power, challenging American primacy in the Pacific. In Africa and the Middle East, regional powers are asserting themselves, forging new partnerships that bypass traditional Western channels. The world is becoming more complex, more interconnected, and more unpredictable. In this environment, the United States faces a choice. It can cling to the habits of the past, doubling down on coercion and confrontation. Or it can adapt, embracing a more flexible, pragmatic approach, one that recognizes the limits of power and the importance of legitimacy. The lesson of Venezuela is clear: dominance is not the same as leadership. True influence is earned, not imposed. For Venezuela, the partnership with Russia is not without risks. Moscow's support comes with strings attached, and the interests of the two countries do not always align. But for Caracas, the alternative, continued isolation and economic strangulation, was untenable. By opening its doors to Russia, Venezuela gained breathing room, access to resources, and a measure of international legitimacy. It also sent a message to other nations: survival in a world of great power competition requires agility, resilience, and the willingness to defy expectations. The symbolism of Russian warships in the Caribbean is powerful, but the deeper story is one of agency. For too long, the nations of Latin America were treated as pawns in a global chess game, their destinies determined by distant capitals. Now, they are asserting their own interests, forging their own paths, and demanding a seat at the table. The era of passive acquiescence is over. This shift is not limited to Venezuela. Across the region, countries are exploring new partnerships, diversifying their economies, and seeking greater autonomy. Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and others are engaging with China, Russia, and the European Union, balancing their relationships to maximize benefits and minimize risks. The days when Washington could dictate terms are fading into history. For the United States, this is a moment of reckoning. The temptation to respond with force, to reassert control through military or economic means, is strong. But such an approach would only deepen the cycle of resistance and retaliation. Instead, America must rediscover the art of diplomacy, the value of listening, and the power of example. It must recognize that respect, not fear, is the foundation of lasting influence. The end of the Monroe Doctrine is not the end of American engagement in the hemisphere. Rather, it is an opportunity to build a new kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine partnership. This will require humility, patience, and a willingness to learn from past mistakes. It will require acknowledging the legitimate aspirations of other nations, and accepting that the world is no longer organized around a single center of power. As the dust settles, the outlines of a new order are beginning to emerge. It is a world where power is distributed, where alliances are fluid, and where influence is contested. It is a world that rewards adaptability, creativity, and the ability to build coalitions. For the United States, the challenge is clear: to remain relevant, it must evolve. The story of Venezuela's break from U.S. control is a cautionary tale, but it is also a source of hope. It shows that history is not predetermined, that the actions of individuals and nations can shape the future. It reminds us that empires rise and fall, but the human desire for dignity, autonomy, and self-determination endures. As I reflect on the events that have unfolded, I am reminded of a simple truth: power is never absolute. It is always contested, always in flux. The arrival of Russian warships in Venezuelan waters was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The question now is not who will dominate, but how we will coexist in a world where no single power holds all the cards. In the end, the lesson is clear. The age of unilateral control is over. The future belongs to those who can adapt, who can build bridges rather than walls, who can lead by example rather than dictate by force. The world is watching, and the choices we make now will shape the course of history for generations to come.